Today we're going to talk about Unit 2, that it's called Burgos Revolutions and the Spanish War of Independence. We're going to start with the Burgos Revolution. We're going to study mainly two revolutions. The first one is the American Revolution, and in second place the French Revolution. We're going to start with the American Revolution. We need to understand that in the 18th century, European countries controlled most of the Americas, but there were also a few areas that were not colonized. The main powers in South America were Spain and Portugal, while the main powers in North America were Spain and Britain. In the 17th and the 18th century, the British established the 13 colonies, as you can see in the map, in North America. Later, they also gained territory from France and Spain, which made the whole area east of the Mississippi River part of the British Empire. The inhabitants were British, German, Dutch, and French colonists, as well as African slaves and Native Americans. Each colony had a governor chosen by the king, but an elected assembly took most important decisions, so the colonies mainly governed themselves. At the end of the 18th century, the 13 colonies rebelled against Britain. This is known as the American Revolution, and it led to the establishment of the United States of America. Next, we will look at the events that led to the American Revolution. First of all, we need to talk about the causes. The causes that led to the American Revolution are these you have here. The first one are the Enlightenment ideas. The Enlightenment ideas that started in France spread all over Europe and America. The colonists were familiar with these ideas of liberty and equality. Then the political factors. The American people were strongly independent. The American people didn't want people an ocean away telling them how to live their lives. Economic and social factors. By the time there was a wealthy colonial bourgeoisie who wanted the freedom to trade without the interference of Great Britain. So, in this short time, the conflict was caused by the high cost of the 7th-year War, in which Great Britain fought against France for control of the territory that today forms part of Canada. Although Great Britain won the war, George III increased taxes on products such as tea, sugar, and lead in order to pay his war debts. As you can see there, in the last years, the English government raised taxes. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, etc. The colonists again refused to pay taxes and saying no taxation without representation. This is going to be the slogan that is going to become more popular. The outbreak is going to be in 1773 when a new tax on the export of tea is going to provoke a mutiny in Boston that we know the Boston Tea Party. The colonists dressed up as Indians dumped a cargo of tea of 3 British ships into the sea. The repression that followed was the origin of the revolution. The British government is going to send troops to Boston and close the port. The event marked the beginning of the conflict. This way is going to start a long war. The war began when some of these colonies decided to fight for independence. In 1775, they created their own army, which was led by George Washington. The war is going to develop in 2 stages. In the first one, Great Britain had some military success, but the colonists took action that were politically significant. The 4th of July in 1776, the Continental Congress proclaimed the Declaration of Independence. In the second stage, the colonists' military victory at the Battle of Saratoga led France and Spain to offer their support. As a result, the two sides were more closely matched in military terms. This led to a ceasefire. In 1787, the United States Constitution was adopted. This established a federal republic based on the Enlightenment principles of equality and liberty. The American Revolution, you can see here, how it's going to be organized, the Constitution of the United States. As you can see, the form of government is going to be a federal republic with the division of powers that follow the Enlightenment principles. Here you have a fragment of these constitutions, The end of the war in 1783, okay, led to the proclaim of the independence of America, okay, and it's going to be the creation of a new country. This you have. Following the example of the American Revolution, we're going to have the French Revolution. Here, first of all, we need to talk about what are the main causes that led us to the French Revolution. The causes are several causes that we can organize, as you can see here: economical, social, political, and ideological. The economical, France lived in a financial crisis. The French monarchy was heavily in debt. The war, because of the court's excessive spending on parties, palaces, and other luxuries, and also because of France's participation in military conflicts, such as the American War of Independence. Also, poor harvest after 1770 led to an increase in the price of grain, which is used to make bread. As a result of high bread prices, the peasants and the urban poor often suffered from hunger. The social crisis led to the economic crisis affected each of the three states differently. The privileged states, the clergy and the nobility, were able to maintain their income, but the third state, the non-privileged, suffered from rising taxes, since they were the only state that paid tax. Also, we have to mention in the political ideological the ideas, the influence of the Enlightenment. The French intellectuals and the bourgeoisie supported the Enlightenment ideas and wanted to put them into practice. For example, they demanded that all French subjects will be free and equal before the law. And they see that thanks to the American independence, it was so that these ideas were possible to develop. This led to a political crisis. In order to improve the situation, the economic situation, the royal finances, Louis XVI's minister suggested that the privileged states should pay taxes. The nobility and clergy refused and demanded that the king call the States General. This was the only body that could approve new taxes. Louis XVI governed France as an absolute monarchy, remember, and he is going to oppose the meeting of the States General so that the states could not limit his power and present their demands. However, in the face of the nobility and clergy's demands, he was forced to call the States General in 1770. The privileged are going to refuse to, once the States Generals are summoned, the privileged are going to refuse to pay more taxes. And the third state is going to ask for reforms and more representation in the voting. But the rest refused to change, and the third state left the States General and summoned in the National Assembly. First, they get together in what we know as the tennis court oath, the 20th of June in 1789, and then they established the National Assembly. There, they promised to continue meeting until they had agreed a new constitution. This is the tennis court oath. Afraid of the reaction of the privileged, they called the people that stormed the fortress of the Bastille. That means the beginning of the French Revolution, the 14th of July of 1789. This is the outbreak. The situation is going to remain very tense. The food prices were still rising, that led to frequent riots. Louis brought more soldiers to Paris to maintain the order, so that is why where the people is going to attack the Bastille, that it was a prison that symbolized the abuses of the absolute monarchy, and also it was where the main arms and weapons of the French were located. So this showed, okay, this is the storm of the Bastille, okay, this showed that the people were becoming more powerful than the king. The revolution has begun. Meanwhile, peasants in the countryside were starving due to poor harvest. There were rumors that the nobles planned to attack them, so the peasants formed militia to protect themselves and burned down some manor houses. In order to calm the situation down, the National Assembly abolished the feudal privilege of the nobles and clergy. This is one of the main stages of this revolution. Once they get together as the Constituent Assembly, as you can see here, that they get together in order to write constitution. One of the first things to calm down the first state was to abolish feudalism by eliminating all the privilege of the lords and the clergy. They confiscated the church property, and this led to discontent of clergy and immigration of many nobles that became counter-revolutionaries and began a campaign to defeat the revolution. But we are going to see how this is going to affect. Okay. All this, Louis XVI is going to ask Austria, that will govern his brother-in-law, Leopold II. Okay, he's going with his whole family is going to try to escape at night in disguise. They almost succeed, but someone recognized Louis and they were stopped at a town called Valence. They were sent back to Paris as prisoners. This is called the flight to Valence. By trying to escape, Louis saw that he didn't support the revolution. Instead of a constitutional monarchy, many people now wanted a republic, accusing the king of treason. In the meanwhile, the Constituent Assembly is going to write the Declarations of Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and also the Constitution, where they are going to establish the main parts of the Enlightenment as a constitutional monarchy, with the monarch's power limited by the Constitution, limited male suffrage that show that the bourgeoisie are going to be the only ones with rights during these revolutions, the separation of powers, etc. We have here a fragment of the Men of the Citizens, and also, just as a curiosity, the Women's March on Versailles. After the storming of the Bastille, power was shared between the Louis and the National Assembly. The Assembly wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, as I told you. In October of that year, a big group of Parisian women walked 20 kilometers to Versailles to complain to the king about the price of bread. Thousands of people joined them, including part of the National Guard. The crowd told the king to come to Paris so he could understand the difficulties. There was a confrontation between the crowds and Louis' guards, and a few guards were killed. The royal family is going to now they're going to remain. This is before they try to flee from Paris. Okay, but the women have a very important role in the revolution. Although them, after they wrote the constitution, they are not going to see any of their demands seen in Britain. We're going to move on, and we're moving to the third stage, that is called the Legislative Assembly. Here is when we need to talk about the main groups, the political groups in which the monarchy, the revolution is going to be divided in. Okay, mainly the Girondins, that are the wealthy bourgeoisie, the moderate constitutional, they prefer a constitutional monarchy and a restricted suffrage and a sovereignty. And on the other hand, we have the Jacobins that are supported by the petit bourgeoisie. They're more radicals. They wanted to abolish monarchy, and the universal manhood suffrage is one of their demands. In the meanwhile, as I told you at the beginning, most part of the clergy and the nobility is going to flee, is going to escape to the countries, the countries outside France. Austria and Prussia, they are not going to like the revolution, so they are going to get together and start a war with the help of Louis XVI. This is going to create unrest among the population, and Louis XVI is going to be imprisoned. The monarchy is going to be abolished, and France is going to become a republic in a new state. In 1792, this is the most radical phase, that is called the Convention. The convention agreed to execute Louis XVI for treason, and he was beheaded by guillotine. The Jacobins now they are going to take the control of the government and impose a dictatorship known as the Terror. The Jacobins were led by Robespierre and supported by the sans-culottes. That the sans-culottes were the ordinary people, okay, that they don't wear culottes, that like kind of a trousers. Okay, so as you can see here, that like the main stages of this period, the convention, the Girondist first, more moderate, the Jacobins or the Reign of Terror, where they're going to eliminate their rivals, and the Termidorans, that they're going to be moderate again. Okay, so during this period, okay, they're going to write another constitution, are going to change France into a republic. Okay, they're going to give weapons to ordinary people. You're going to expect to kill people just because of their suspicion that they are opposing the revolution. They are going to introduce universal suffrage for men, and they're going to kill Louis XVI. Okay, you can see here. This is the era that we call as the Terror. Okay, they are going to create a new calendar. Okay, this is the calendar with no religious meaning. They are going to continue with the war against European countries. They're going to give, as I told you, the weapons to ordinary people and the repression of the counter-revolutionaries. Anyone suspected of opposing the revolution could be executed. Okay, you have here 40,000 people is going to be killed. Okay, the new constitution that establishes our republic, and also they are going to establish some laws related with improving the quality of life of people. For example, the law of maximum with the control of prices for the basic products. In this, okay, when they change into the Termidorans at the end, okay, it's going to change into a new type of government that it's going to call the Directory. This is the more conservative, made up only of 5 members. One of these 5 members is going to be Napoleon. Okay, the power and influence of the army increased as a result of the continuing foreign war, and of the threat that the radical revolutionaries might return to power. These are the 2 wars. Okay, this is like the French Revolutionary Wars, in order to stop the French Revolution from spreading to other European countries, Austria, Prussia, Spain, etc. They get together and they fight against France into 2 wars. You have the dates, both with French victory. Okay, so in this era, okay, the Directory, okay, as I told you, during the Directory, Napoleon is going to gain a lot more and more power fighting against the European coalitions. But the 9th of November of 1799, he's going to stage a coup d'etat, and he's going to become the savior of the revolution. And he's going to establish a consulate of 3 members. He was one of them in the 1802. He's going to proclaim himself first, unique, and for life council. This is going to lead into the first French Empire with Napoleon as emperor with almost absolute power. He's going to make a new constitution in 1804, where he's going to become the emperor, and no separation of powers, a lot of reduction in freedom, etc. Well, for most people, is the end of the French Revolution. But we need to mention some of the reforms that he's going to apply. For example, in the economic, he's going to establish the Bank of France, which helped to end very high inflation. Roads, bridges, and canals were repaired in order to make trade easier, and loans were given to industry. He provided cheap bread and made the tax system fairer, which increased the incomes of peasants. The religious reforms in 1801, Napoleon signed a concordat with the Catholic Church, which gave it a special status. However, there was still freedom of religion, and the church had no political power. And in legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code made the law the same in all France. It gave all men the same rights, so people from different social backgrounds could get important government jobs. However, The code also increased men's control over the wives and brought back slavery in French colonies. As well as these reforms, Napoleon allowed aristocrats who had emigrated to return to France. They had no political privilege, but they were all able to keep some of their wealth. This is a fragment of the civil code. Under Napoleon, France established a huge empire. In the whole empire, Napoleon introduced reforms based on the French system. Most people in the conquered countries disliked being ruled by foreigners, but the reforms made Napoleon popular with some members of the bourgeoisie. Initially, they considered him as a liberator from their tyrannical monarchs, absolute monarchs. However, Napoleon's popularity outside France soon fell. Napoleon styled members of his family as rulers of the other European states. They ruled for the benefit of France, rather than for the local people. France tried to stop its allies trading with Britain, which increased the price of textiles, sugar, coffee, and tobacco. As a result, the sense of nationalism in the conquered countries is going to increase. Napoleon is going to lead the French army to victory after victory during the revolution. And this is going to let the empire, as you can see here, gradually expand. In 1805, there were two very important battles. Austerlitz, when it's made France the dominant power of the European continent, and Trafalgar. The British Navy, commanded by Lord Nelson, defeated the French and Spanish navies. This made Britain the dominant power also at sea. Okay, you have here a summary of the wars, okay, several battles, Trafalgar, Austerlitz, etc. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with around 500,000 men, including most of his best soldiers. The Russian army retreated without fighting and burned the countryside behind it, so that there would be no food for the French. Finally, the two armies met at the Battle of Borodino near Moscow. The French won, but many of their soldiers were killed or wounded, and they didn't destroy the Russian army. The Russians evacuated Moscow, taking all the food with them. Without food for his huge army, Napoleon had to return home. Winter was approaching and temperatures fell below minus 30 degrees. The French army suffered terribly from the cold, from starvation, and because the Russian army constantly attacked them. Very few French soldiers returned to France alive. Napoleon's army was badly weakened, and in 1813 he lost the Battle of Leipzig against Russia, Austria, and Prussia. He was forced into exile on the islands of Elba, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. We have to mention that Napoleon was a brilliant general that is going to defeat and win many wars. The failures of the Grand Army in Russia and the defeat in the Iran Peninsula is going to take them to the first exile to Elba. After that, he's going to try to restore his power, what we as with how we know as the 100 Days Empire. At the end, he's going to be defeated at Waterloo, and he is going to be exiled to Santa Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821, putting an end to the Napoleon Empire. The consequences of all the revolution and the French Revolution is everything that you have here. Okay, we have a lot of social legacy, social changes, etc. The political changes are that the most part of the empire is going to be constitutional monarchy or republic, that national sovereignty, restricted suffrage, and the separation of powers are going to be established in most part of these countries, as political parties are going to disappear, and the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens were written. All citizens are going to pay taxes by the abolition of feudalism, and free trade and respect for private property is going to establish. In social changes, everyone was now equal before the law, and they have the right to vote. But mainly, this is the bourgeoisie, the ones that have the right to participate in politics. These are the main consequences that we need to mention of the French Revolution.